and I am from Slippery Rock University. And Stephanie?
I'm from Otterbein University in Ohio.
And we come from different disciplines, so this is kind of a cool partnership because I'm a recreational therapist, and we have Storm Harbor Equestrian Center on our campus, which is an equine, premier accredited equine center. And Stephanie is an equine scientist. So we've been working together on a project, and we're funded by the Horses and Humans Research Foundation to do it. So basically we're gonna we want to get an idea from you all what you would like us to format this presentation. We've got it all formatted. We could talk to you for 2 hours, and we obviously have 40 minutes. So I was wondering how many of you are practitioners? Okay, and how many of you are researchers? Okay, so we're going to gear this presentation a little bit more formally towards the results so that practitioners can get that information. We're going to spend less time on the intricate details of the methodology because it was pretty complicated in terms of all the things that we did. It's an 18-month study, but we will kind of go through the methods pretty quickly, and then if you want to ask us questions later, feel free to do that. But we think we want to get to the results part because that's probably what you want to hear and want to learn more about. Most of you know enough about autism, so I'm going to tell you that this was based in theory and based on what we know about children with autism. If you want to read more about this study, we actually just published it in the Journal of Autism and Related Disorders, so all of the information is in that article, and you can read all the details in that respect. One of the things that we did focus on in the study is we looked at adolescents with autism. And there's been less studies done on adolescents than younger children, so that was an area we wanted to focus on. And we were specifically honing in on stress in this population, instead of social skills, which I have done some other work on. We were looking at stress. So basically we were looking at 2 methods of stress reduction, and we were comparing the two to control. So we were wanting to know, is mindfulness, this HeartMath mindfulness, and therapeutic horseback riding, are they equally beneficial? Is one better than the other? What's the comparative effectiveness of these 2 methodologies? And we compared them to control. It's pretty significant because one of the things rec therapists do a lot of times in practice is run mindfulness or stress management groups, and we were wanting to see if the therapeutic riding had the same effect for adolescents with autism.
All right, why cortisol? So we wanted to add some sort of biometric to our study. We chose cortisol because, as many of you probably know, it's known as the stress hormone produced by the adrenal glands. It's involved with the hypothalamic pituitary axis, so I won't go through all the details of that, but basically is released in response to physical or psychological threat. And it also follows a diurnal rhythm, so we tried to address that in our methods. You'll see typically a sharp increase 30 minutes after awakening, and higher values in the morning as far as cortisol concentration, and then lower values throughout the day. Although we'll talk about how sometimes individuals with autism differ from that typical pattern. Youth with autism may have some abnormal cortisol variations within their diurnal rhythm. Others have found higher evening cortisol values for individuals with autism, and also elevated cortisol in response to social interactions, which you can probably imagine as individuals with autism sometimes struggle with social interaction.
So why do we choose HeartMath as a measurement tool? I'm a HeartMath specialist, and basically it's a mindfulness methodology, but they also have some tools that are very simple biometric measures of heart rate variability. And it basically, and I have one in my bag if you want to see it, but basically clips to your ear, and measures your heart rate variability, and it's very easily transportable, so it worked for our study because we wanted to get people up on horses and have this stuff click to their ear. We didn't want something that you had to have a computer where you're dragging it around to understand the heart rate variability. So we were looking for practicality in this measurement. So our methodology ended up being pretty multifactorial, and we were measuring a lot of things. So what we ended up doing, because people with autism when you see one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism, right? We talk about that a lot. So we wanted to measure them against themselves and compare the effectiveness for them themselves. So what we did was a crossover design. So it took 18 months, and we basically had 3 groups in which they were actually randomly assigned to these groups, and basically there was a variability in what order that they got the treatment. So we were trying to get rid of any testing effects and that kind of thing as we were doing the study. So basically we had a path where every single person that was enrolled in the study got the stress management training, got the therapeutic horseback riding, and also had a control phase. And we call these phases. And as we go through the study and explain the results, it's kind of important to realize that every person got each one of these interventions. I mean, the control isn't an intervention, but it's a phase. We ended up with 27 subjects that stayed throughout the whole 18 months. And it was 20 males, 7 females, and you can see the demographic breakdown. We're from a rural area of Pennsylvania, and so we did not have a lot of minority diversity because of the situation where we provide service. One of the things to keep in mind that I mentioned, there were phases, and before every phase we collected baseline data, and after every phase, which was 10 weeks, we collected follow-up data. We also collected data within the sessions as well, before the session started and right after the session. So we did a lot of collecting of saliva, and I affectionately called it the spit study. So if you remember anything, you can call it the spit study.
All right, on to the human sampling. So again, we did baseline and follow-up samples before and after each phase. And then we also did pre and post samples before and after each specific session, whether it was a HeartMath session or therapeutic riding session. Betsy was in charge of the social responsiveness scale, stress survey for persons with autism, and perceived stress scale. So those were administered before and after each of those phases. And then we also, as she mentioned, collected lots of spit. We did 2 consecutive days of saliva sampling. This was actually done by the parents, but there was follow-up to make sure that they were consistently following this protocol, and then we made sure that the saliva was stored appropriately. So the samples were taken upon awakening, 30 minutes after awakening, at the scheduled time of intervention, but no intervention was happening, and then within 30 minutes of bedtime. And this was done over 2 consecutive days, and then we averaged them. We got a mean from those. And then the pre and post samples were taken right before and right after each particular session. So there were 10 sessions for therapeutic riding, 10 sessions for HeartMath, and we did before and after saliva samples, and then also coherence for the heart rate variability. For the control, it was pretty much the same, except there was no individual session, so we didn't do the pre and post after each session, because then they would have just been at home or doing their other activities, and no point doing all of those extra samples at that time. And then we also sampled the horses. So we did control samples during the lesson time, but on a day when the horse was not scheduled for lessons, and the horse just remained in their stall, and a sample was taken at 4 o'clock and 4:30 to match up with the pre and post samples that we also took. So the pre and post samples were done right before and right after the riding lessons. So saliva was taken for both of those. Saliva collection. So I'll kind of skim through the saliva collection and analysis, but what we did for the horses was we used these oral swabs that you can see. It's this long object here. So basically we just stuck that under their tongue for 60 seconds. They all tolerated it really well, surprisingly. I was afraid they'd think it was a dewormer, but no, they just stood there with it in their mouth. And then for humans, we either did a saliva collection device like that, but it was a little bit shorter since we didn't need it to be quite so long.
And if you've had a rapid COVID test, you know what it's like. Same thing.
And then the participants who could spit into the vial, this is called the passive drool method, they used that particular method. But some of them were gagging on that method, so we had to switch some of them to the swab that we use for the horses. Participants and horses' saliva, they refrained from eating within 60 minutes prior to the sampling times because we didn't want to contaminate the swabs, or meals can affect cortisol, so we wanted to keep that variable out of the way. And then the swabs and collection devices were from Salimetrics, which is the company that sells those kinds of kits. And then for the salivary cortisol, we stored it at -20 Celsius, which is like your regular freezer that you'd have in your house. And then we use these kits from Salimetrics. They were ELISA kits, and you can look them up on the Salimetrics website if you want. And then I won't go through all this. The protocol is actually on the Salimetrics website if you want to look it up. Or if you're a practitioner and you don't feel like doing all this science in your lab and you want to do something with cortisol, you can actually send it to Salimetrics and they'll analyze it for you. But we did all the science.
It's a little bit more expensive.
Yeah, it's more expensive and not as fun, right? So then we read the kits with the plate reader, and basically it shows a color change based on how much cortisol is bound to each of these wells. So we ran them in duplicate, which means 2 samples. We used up 2 wells for each of the samples. And then our results were in micrograms cortisol per deciliter of saliva.
In terms of the heart rate variability, I've already mentioned to you, it's basically just a very light device that you place on the person's ear. We're not going to play the movie for you today, but basically 2 of my students were just demonstrating it. Basically, it's very light. It really didn't bother any of the participants. And for the when they were riding on horseback, we actually put it in a very light backpack on their back, those cheap ones that you get given away. And then for the participants in the HeartMath sessions, they held it during that session. And just wanted to mention that everyone was trained in the same way. So every person that was an instructor in these particular programs, we used the same instructors over the whole 18 months. The therapeutic riding instructor was a rec therapist, certified rec therapist, plus a PATH instructor, and the HeartMath coach, he had a HeartMath coach certification plus being a rec therapist. What we were looking for is really continuity, and that everybody had the same amount of training as a background, and then this specialty training above that, and then keeping those instructors the same, so that we could say it's not the instructor change that made the change. So this is just a little bit of the protocol that we used.
And we did the same one each phase. So participants who drew the therapeutic riding for the first phase, it was the same as those who drew it for the second phase or the third phase. So it was consistent the whole time.
And it's kind of important to recognize these are just titles for our manual that we use. So every single one was written out in terms of what was supposed to be done during that session, so that we could keep it consistent throughout the 18 months. I think having a manual is really helpful in that respect. And then in terms of our therapeutic riding protocol, this was each week what we did during that week. And again, it was written out in a very manualized way, so it could be followed to the T. And you know, even if you have the same person doing it, it's important for them to follow a manual, so that, because you can forget, you know, exactly what you did the last time. So we really were persnickety about those things. And then the HeartMath protocol, this was a traditional mindfulness program, but we adapted it for people with autism. So instead of just telling them to do deep breathing, we actually had visuals that we used where we actually showed them what it was that we were trying to teach them in the HeartMath protocol. And we also sometimes we did games with it so they could really understand what we were trying to teach about the mindfulness. So it was an adapted mindfulness program, not just a talk therapy program. And one of the things in terms of statistics, when we start getting into that, I think it's important to think about how we did the statistics. We've just listed these out for you, and we'll go through what we got from the results. So I think we're not going to go over all of this. It's just important to recognize we did a number of statistics because we had so much data. In terms of the cortisol, we ended up doing ANOVAs, both 3-way and 2-way ANOVAs. And then on a certain data that was not normal, we needed to do a Wilcox sign rate.
And also log transformed the data too before the ANOVAs, so because those data weren't normal either. This was like a little spin-off project. So in the last session, the speaker talked about student honors projects. I had an honors student who was helping me in the lab run all of the salivary cortisol samples for like all of the HHRF data. And for her honors project, she wanted to tie her project into that. So basically, what we did was we used the same horses, the horses that made the cut the whole way through. There were 10 horses of various breeds that you might see at a therapeutic riding center. So there was a halflinger, a couple quarter horses, one was an Arabian Mustang cross, a Dutch warmblood. So there was a bit of variety and kind of the older age that you might see at a typical therapeutic riding center. But the collection times were the same for all 3 of her little faces that she used. So she collected saliva at 4 and 4:30 p.m. Also avoided feeding them 60 minutes prior, and then no riding or lunging or other activities like that day before the sample collection. The therapeutic riding sessions that were used were 2 sessions of 9 30-minute weekly lessons, and those were the ones that we used for the data that Betsy was previously mentioning. We took 2 lessons out because we saw a really high pre-value on the day when they did clipping and horse pizza. And I asked about the horse pizza, and a feed cart was rolled down the aisle. So that made their pre-values very high that day. So we dropped that one from the analysis because it didn't seem representative of like the other values. We also did grooming just so that she could compare what is just a grooming session due to the salivary cortisol levels. So there were 30 minutes of grooming by volunteers performed twice within a 4-day span, and we followed a strict protocol where we would tell the groomers like which tool to use at which time so that it followed the exact half hour. And then we also did a control where the horses just remained in their stall for 30 minutes. They hadn't been moved to the stall, they were already in the stall where they typically are at that time. And then we just did that twice within a 2-day span. And then we checked for normality with this too, but the data were normal. We looked at one-way repeated measures of ANOVA, comparing the difference between the pre and the post values.
So, the results of this study. I'm going to start back with some of the measures that we did with the self-report, the parent report, and then we'll get into the cortisol. So first of all, this is the participant's self-report of their stress. And this is kind of a crazy graph. It probably doesn't mean a lot, so I thought I would kind of break it down for you. Basically, what we found is that in terms of therapeutic riding, and when we compared that to the stress management, that there was some specific, and control, there were some specific items that kind of stood out to us in terms of where therapeutic riding was actually more significant and at a higher mean value than actually the HeartMath means. So definitely receiving a reprimand, criticism marked incorrectly, being unable to communicate the needs, being able to assert oneself, waiting for reinforcement, waiting for routine to begin. All of those, the therapeutic riding means were much higher than the HeartMath means, meaning that therapeutic riding was more effective than the stress management program in that respect. Definitely the therapeutic riding was greater than the control means in terms of perception of stress in a group activity, which makes a lot of sense, and having a change in staff, teacher, or supervisor. When we looked at the HeartMath, it means that we're greater than control. The two things that stood out was being prevented from carrying out a ritual and following a diet. And the control mean was greater than the therapeutic writing mean, with being prevented from carrying out a ritual, and also was greater than HeartMath in terms of receiving a reprimand. But you can see the therapeutic writing on the whole was a lot, had much higher means in terms of the self-report than did the HeartMath or the control. In terms of the parent report, we were looking at these things from all different angles. The parent report showed no significant change in that, remember, baseline to follow-up in any of the phases that we did. And we looked at total score as well as the scale scores of the SSRT and SRS2, basically that is social responsiveness scale, and it's really looking at behavior, because if you think about it, a parent can't really know what a child is thinking in terms of their stress level. They can only see the behavior of the child. So we could only really ask the parent about the behavior. What we did see, though, when we looked at the means and compared the means, was that in the control phase, parents reported that their children were more fidgety. And I think that's pretty interesting, because basically they were either getting stress management or they were getting therapeutic writing. When they were in the control and they were at home, they were a lot more fidgety. And they didn't understand cause and effect as well. In the horseback riding phase, they showed significant improvement in terms of the ability to recognize when something's unfair and avoidance of starting social interactions. And the HeartMath phase, we saw things like a decrease in the behavior in ways that are strange or bizarre, difficulty in changing routine, and wandering aimlessly from one activity to another. So you can see these are behaviors that we ask the parents about. When we compared the coherence, and this is the heart rate variability measure, what we saw is that the stress management group was much more effective than the therapeutic writing in terms of coherence level. And we'll talk about that in a minute, why we think that's the case. Basically, we compared the overall mean of the coherence in therapeutic writing as well as in the stress management, and basically their coherence values were much significantly higher in the HeartMath than the therapeutic writing.
All right, for the cortisol results, these are the human results. We didn't find a statistically significant three-way or two-way interaction in our ANOVA, which would indicate a difference between like the treatments from baseline to follow-up at the different times, which we kind of thought maybe we would see that, but we didn't see one. We did see that diurnal sampling time of day was statistically significant as a main effect, which meant that we did find differences by time of day, which is good because the participants did follow a diurnal rhythm of their cortisol concentrations. And then we found a trend, which means that it's not P less than 0.05 for treatment. So a little bit of a difference for the treatments, but if we were to see a difference like from baseline to follow-up at the different times, then that would have been an interaction, which we didn't see an interaction. And then for the cortisol awakening response increase, so typically, like I said, you would see like that increase 30 minutes after awakening. We didn't find an interaction there either. However, we did for time find a statistically significant main effect where we found some higher follow-up cortisol awakening response increases compared to the baseline. And then this is the non-transformed data. So again, I said I log transformed it. This is just the raw means. You see cortisol here in milligrams or micrograms per deciliter on the y-axis, and then you see our different treatments at baseline or follow-up here on the x-axis. The green, these are our awakening responses. This is the 30-minute post-awakening, is the orange. This is at session time, and then that's 30 minutes before bedtime. So you can see the higher values at the beginning of the day versus the end of the day. And again, we didn't see statistically significant differences for any of the interactions, but you could kind of see a difference here just visually. So for therapeutic writing follow-up, we had a lower awakening response compared to the control or the HeartMath And we have kind of an idea of maybe why that happened on another slide. All right, for the individual sessions, for pre and post, we did find pretty interesting results here. For every single one of the therapeutic writing lessons, we found a reduction in cortisol after the lesson. So when we compared right before to right after the writing lesson, all of our therapeutic writing lessons were significantly different. So seems like a pretty good, like acute short-term effect there on cortisol. And then for the HeartMath, 7 of the sessions, when we looked at the individual sessions, were lower afterwards compared to before. And then we also did like the combined 1 through 10 to check that. There was no difference between the pre-HeartMath and pre-therapeutic writing, which is good. That shows that they were pretty similar before. And then no difference between the post overall HeartMath and post-therapeutic writing, so both seem to be pretty much equally effective at reducing the cortisol. And then the post was significantly lower than the pre for both HeartMath and therapeutic writing. We also compared these to control baseline. We didn't find any difference between control baseline and pre-therapeutic writing median. And then we found that pre-HeartMath, post-HeartMath, and post-therapeutic writing were significantly lower than control baseline. Okay, and then again, this is like the data that's not been transformed or anything. And this is means, not medians. We looked at medians because the data weren't normal. Here we have cortisol in micrograms per deciliter, and then on the x-axis we have the individual sessions, and then control baseline there at the end. The green is therapeutic writing pre, the orange is therapeutic writing post, the yellow is HeartMath pre, and then the like burgundy color is HeartMath post. So you can see kind of the difference before and after, I didn't put any like statistical differences on this because this is means, not medians, and I looked at medians, but there was a difference before and after every single therapeutic writing lesson.
And typically the drop in the therapeutic writing was much bigger drop than you saw in the HeartMath. So you started up higher and you had a deeper dip in the cortisol.
Yeah, and just like this was kind of interesting to me. This wasn't statistically different, but this was a horse show, so it was a little clear that. Okay, and then here's the horse results. So this is the change from pre to post. So change in cortisol in micrograms per deciliter there on the y-axis, and then the lesson number here. Again, I dropped number 5 because that was horse pizza and clipping day, which wasn't quite like matching up with the other ones. So we didn't find any difference from before and after compared to control for any of these lessons except for number 4. And then I thought that was interesting. Why number 4? So I looked back, and it was the day when they focused on walk-trot transitions. So I don't think that the cortisol increase was due to exercise because they also trotted this day, like pretty much the rest of the later lessons. But I think it was that first day when they were focusing on the walk-to-trot transitions. Maybe some of you have like experienced some of the riders maybe not being as balanced that first day, or just kind of excited. Maybe a little harder on the horses' mouths, I don't know. But that day they did seem to, the horses had an increase in their cortisol from before to after.
And it's kind of fascinating that there'd be a difference based on what you're doing in the lesson that day. I think that's really interesting.
How does it overlap with the participants? Like session 4, was there significance with session 4 and the participants as well?
I don't think so. No, because yeah, it's pretty similar to the other patterns that we saw there. So I think the participants weren't affected, but the horses were. And this was from my student's honors project, where she compared the Horses and Humans Research Foundation therapeutic writing sessions with the grooming ones and then control. And there was no statistical difference for the change in time for each of those. Kind of wonder if we had a bigger sample size, maybe you might see more of a reduction in the grooming. But the main idea, I guess, is that none of them were were significantly different from control, so grooming didn't stress them out, or it didn't decrease their cortisol, and same with therapeutic riding.
All right, so what do we make of all this? When we looked at the self-report of the participants and their stress level, one of the things that we noticed was that the mean values of things that they would perceive as very stressful in terms of social interaction, those were actually better when we looked at therapeutic riding than they were in terms of the stress management groups. And we kind of wanted to know why. Why did that happen? What's going on here? One of the things that we do know is that the HeartMath sessions focused a lot on the topic of stress. So we talked about stress a lot, and what's your stress factor, and if you breathe, you know, make sure you're breathing, and let's breathe this way so you can control your stress. So there was an obvious discussion about stress during those sessions. Now, therapeutic riding, we didn't talk about stress. It was an experience. And basically the process was one which decreased the client's stress without them thinking about it or talking about it. And so we wonder if perhaps what is happening is that, you know, the clients after that stress management phase were thinking more about stress in their life but had less ability to handle it on their own. Whereas the therapeutic riding, they were experiencing a stress reduction just from the experience. In terms of the parent report, one thing that we did note is the parents and the kids did not, or the participants didn't really line up in terms of what they were saying. Now there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, the participants were reporting their perceived level of stress. A parent can't know what a participant thinks. On the other hand, the parents were reporting behaviors, what they were seeing, what they were thinking, how they felt about the whole program. So in some respects, you could think about it as two separate constructs. Maybe that's why they don't agree. The second thing is that the parents may be kind of answering about the last week and really thinking about that question being, how have you felt, or what have you observed in the last 7 days? And the participant was more going on how they felt in the moment. And I think that that's possible. So, I mean, those are some things that kind of think about as why parent and adolescent data don't jive, but I would think that that's pretty common in typical situations. I think about me and my own adolescent children. We don't always see things exactly the same way. So, and then human cortisol, we have some thoughts on that as well.
As far as why the cortisol awakening response increase was absent in therapeutic riding, and then HeartMath baseline and therapeutic riding follow-up, well, in the first place, it seems pretty variable when you look at the literature among adolescents with autism, so it might have just been variation over time. But there was one study that I thought was interesting where they looked at, they placed children with autism with a service dog, and they found that when they were placed with the service dog, they had a reduction in their cortisol awakening response increase. And they thought, those authors thought that maybe it was due to sleep quality, that the participants were sleeping better when they were placed with the service dog. And then when the service dog was taken away, the cortisol awakening response increased again. There was another study where they found that motor exercise reduced the cortisol awakening response. And another one that found increased physical fitness reduced it. Now, we didn't measure sleep quality or their motor abilities or their physical fitness, so it's hard to say, but those are just some other, I don't know, differences between, I guess, the therapeutic riding versus the HeartMath and why it might have been different in that case. We didn't find any big differences from baseline to follow-up, so we didn't find like a long-term effect on the cortisol concentrations, but we did see significant decreases in cortisol concentrations following each of the therapeutic riding sessions and most of the HeartMath sessions, so a pretty notable effect there. We found for the horses no difference in the equine cortisol concentrations when we were looking at therapeutic riding, grooming, or standing in a stall, so it didn't appear to negatively impact the horses, what we were doing with them. But we did note that one increase during lesson 4, which was the walk to trot transition lesson. So that might be something to take note of. It might be interesting to look more at specific activities during these sessions to see what might increase the horse's cortisol versus decrease.
And then the coherence. One of the things that's kind of interesting, remember I told you that when we collected the heart rate variability, that our participants wore it on a little backpack while they were on the horse. And then the participants in the stress management held that, and they could actually see the light changing. And so basically this device kind of tells you if you're in coherence or not. So one of my theories about why the HeartMath was so much more effective with the coherence is that it was in the backpack when they were riding. They were not aware of what their coherence was, so there's no biofeedback effect. However, when they got into the group and they actually had this thing and they could say, oh, can I get it to go into the green? There's some biofeedback effect going on with that. And so we wonder if that could have played a role in that. And you know, I think that that's entirely possible. So what are some applications for you all? Number one, we do know that basically that therapeutic riding does decrease the stress hormone cortisol for that immediate time period. We saw that pretty clearly. We did it, same program over 18 months in 27 people, and we saw that, definitely.
Every session too.
Every session. So we know that has happened, and we compared it to a stress management program that should reduce stress and should see that decrease in cortisol. And so we were seeing equal things in those two groups. And so I think that is a takeaway, that even if it wasn't a long-term effect, we're seeing it happen during that session. Another thing that I think that to be considerate about is that when you look at these two interventions and compare them, as I compare them as a rec therapist, there are certain participants who would do much better in therapeutic riding than they would in a stress management program. The stress management program requires a lot of verbal skills. It requires you to sit in a circle for a long period of time. There's a lot more requirements in terms of verbalization and being able to socialize. And if a child or participant or adolescent has a lot of social anxiety, or perhaps they don't have strong verbal skills, the therapeutic riding actually is a better intervention for them. So we also have to think about what's required of the person during the intervention when we go to use this. Did you want to talk about the Carrie?
Just that this is just reiterating that we found more of a cortisol awakening response increase after the control and HeartMath phases and lower during the therapeutic riding phase. So it would be interesting to find out why that might be. Doing some more follow-ups, like is the sleep quality affected? Is it something due to like the motor activity or increased physical fitness?